Welcome to The Access. I'm your host, Hayvi Bouzo. In this episode, we'll be discussing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and what some people call the deal of the century, the American policy towards Iran and Syria, and the broader region. Joining us to talk about this is Ilan Goldenberg, who served previously as a senior professional staff member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and during the Obama administration, he was appointed the chief of staff for the special envoy for the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, and is now a senior fellow and the director for the Middle East Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. Thank you so much, Ilan Goldenberg, for joining us today.
Great to be here.
Obviously, you have a long history working with the American government on Middle East-related issues. Now you're in the think tank world, but I want to go back to previously. Between 2012 2013, you were working with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. You were also one of the people who worked with Menendez and, at the time, Senator John Kerry on supporting the Syrian opposition at the time. Please tell me about basically the recommendations you drafted for the Senate to support a transition in Syria at the time, and what happened then.
Sure. So I was working in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee as the chief Middle East staffer. And what we did was we finally managed to get out of the committee a piece of legislation that eventually became one of the early train and equip programs, which actually, unfortunately, failed relatively catastrophically. But what we started with at the time was this idea of we need to arm the Syrian opposition, we need to support the opposition, and we need to look for a transition away from Bashar al-Assad. And this was, I think, the original vision of the legislation. Unfortunately, though, you get into negotiations with how do you get something through the Senate. And this is where all kinds of extra limitations get put on what exactly you can provide and who you can provide it to and how you can do it. And it's understandable. There were a lot of concerns at the time in the U.S. government about, weapons getting into the wrong hands. But inevitably, when you start arming opposition groups, some weapons are going to get into the wrong hands. At least that was always my view. And you couldn't, if you decide you were going to do it, you might as well just do it instead of handcuffing yourself with all these different limitations. And so, even the negotiation we had then, this was mid-2012. This was very early on or maybe early 2013 in these discussions in Washington. Ultimately, it was a piece of legislation that worked in Washington, but created a program that could never work in Syria. And so, which I think was
why is that?
Why? Because the limitations, sort of the vetting requirements that were associated with it were probably the most significant, right? So you had different members of the Senate who were willing, ultimately, to support arming the Syrian opposition, but they wanted all these restrictions because they were afraid of that New York Times story, right? The one that says, this weapon that the U.S. gave to somebody in Syria has ended up in the hands of Al-Qaeda or ISIS. And so, but the reality is,
but
Syria
2013 there was no ISIS.
So it was, at the time it was Al-Qaeda.
Al-Qaeda.
Yes, it was Al-Qaeda. It was still the same basic fear.
Yeah.
ISIS was just starting to launch that, but ISIS is in some ways just Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which then became ISIS.
Yes.
So the fear of that then created a situation where, on all this legislation, all kinds of rules, you will verify exactly that none of these people are terrorists in any way. You will make sure that they are, that they meet all these different requirements, and only when you have 100% certainty will you give them any weapons. And the level of vetting was so high that I think it became part of the reason the program didn't work, because you're in the middle of a civil war, you're in the middle of a conflict environment. You don't have that kind of information.
Do you believe that at the time, and obviously from that moment on, you did work at the Obama administration, you were part of it, but focusing on different issues regarding to the region, and we'll get there shortly. But was it the administration at the time that also put a lot of hindering on giving any help or assistance to kind of maybe change the way things, and then knowing how they ended up being?
Yes, it was ultimately the president. I mean, I'm a big fan of Barack Obama's. I worked for him for a number of years on different issues, or for his administration. But the one issue I always disagreed with him on was Syria, where I felt if the U.S. had intervened in those early years more aggressively before the Russian intervention, we really could have been decisive at a time where it would have made a huge difference and at a relatively low cost, in my opinion. So I think this whole idea that we had no options and everything, just look at the fact, here, I'll give you the best example, right? In the last couple of years, the Israelis have struck about 1,000 targets inside of Syria, basically in Russian air-controlled space, right? All these Iranian targets, 200 separate sorties into the country. They haven't lost a pilot. There hasn't been a war. It's actually all remained relatively calm. So the whole argument that, well, the Syrian air defenses are so strong, you couldn't possibly do anything against them, the Israelis are proving that's just not true. And I think...
Even though that Russia actually handled S-300 air defense system.
Yes, yes.
And still wasn't true.
Right, exactly, because the Russians don't want to shoot down Israelis either. The notion that I think it was a combination of things. I don't think President Obama wanted to do it. I don't think the U.S. military wanted to do it either, which is why they had all these ridiculous options. Like, if you want to strike in Syria, you got to start by taking out all the air defenses, and then you need to have 70,000 troops on the ground. Well, the president sees that, and he's like, well, I don't want to do that. And so that's the end of it. So
that was General Dempsey at the time also being,
Yeah, so it was everyone.
The president against it.
Right. It was the president, it was the military, and it was the Congress that liked to talk a big game about supporting intervention. But when President Obama gave Congress the opportunity to vote on military intervention, it couldn't get its act together to support it either after the red line moment, I mean, people criticize President Obama for sending that over to the Senate after making pretty clear that he was going to do it, which I think was a mistake and not the way he should have handled it. But at the same time, the Senate also wouldn't support it. So really it was across the board, I think, political decision by all the different parts of the U.S. government to essentially not support that.
Have you seen, Ilan, that things were going to get to where we are today? Now we have the Idlib province, we have the SDF-controlled areas. Did you see this coming?
No, I mean, I don't really think anybody, well, what did we see coming at the time? I think we knew things were going to be bad. Things were already terrible and potentially getting worse. Nobody could have seen everything or precisely how this would go. But it's not at all surprising in retrospect. You created an opportunity for Iran to intervene in Syria in a major way, created an opportunity for ISIS to be created, which caused huge headaches for everyone. And I mean, one thing I don't think anybody really saw coming was the level of Russian interference. I mean, Russia's intervention into Syria, it's really the first major Russian intervention into the Middle East since, it depends, maybe either 1973, since the Arab-Israeli War in 1973, or maybe Afghanistan, if you count that, but I don't really think of Afghanistan as part of the Middle East. So the Russians have fundamentally changed the perception of them in the region. Now everybody looks at the Russians, it's like, wow, they're a big new player in the region that nobody had seen in a really long time. So all these things, all these knock-on effects, and then of course the refugee crisis, the challenges it's created in Europe, challenges it's created domestically in the United States, all these things, in some ways all stem out of the inability to intervene earlier in Syria.
Today in Syria, we know that there's the Idlib province. There is an existence of the element of the Al-Qaeda HTS at this time, while there's the 3 million plus civilians, bombs and missiles launched by the Russians and the Assad regime. How do you see the solution for this? Because it's a big equation, it's a big problem. Not many people know what to do. Yeah,
I mean, really none of the solutions are good at this point. It's very challenging because on the one hand, yes, you do have HTS, which is a terrorist organization, which has a fair bit of control in Idlib. I mean, controls large chunks of Idlib, though it's not necessarily that popular in Idlib, and people need to remember that. You have the Turks, who really don't want a major offensive, which brings thousands of refugees, potentially more, into Turkey, which then could get spread out over Europe and other places as well. You have the Russians and the Assad regime, who seem intent on pushing forward there, but the Iranians, who are not really on the ground in Idlib. I mean, I still think maybe the best solution is still a diplomatic deal with Turkey and a long-term effort by Turkey to support non-extremist groups inside of Idlib to, over time, turn against HTS and increase the influence of these other actors. But that is going to take a long time, and it's not exactly clear it can work, but I think it's better than the humanitarian disaster that comes if the Assad regime, as the Assad regime is starting to do now, basically is trying to attack and retake the entire area.
And it doesn't seem that things are moving forward, even though they were seeing horrifying images coming out of Idlib with civilians and children. But it doesn't seem to be moving things in the direction of the Russians and the Assad regime so far. I mean, that's going to take so much more loss of life. What do you think the United States could do if things keep escalating in that way and the images of children become just unbearable for people to be taken? I mean, especially knowing that there's millions.
Well, the sad thing is that at least right now, nobody's paying, in the U.S. and Washington, nobody's really paying attention to what's happening in Idlib, which is, you know, Syria used to be on the front pages of I think, Washington papers and U.S. papers, the humanitarian catastrophe over the past few years. But at least this whole offensive in Idlib, nobody's even watching it, which is really unfortunate. Because, I would like to see the U.S. get more engaged in some kind of process to pull back, to try to restrain the Assad regime and the Russians, and to also get the Turks more in there to try to be more constructive. But we don't have that much leverage at this point. I mean, we have basically walked out of Syria for the most part. We have leverage in the northeast, in the SDF territories, in the areas that American sort of supported troops still hold. But that's it. We've walked out of the southwest. We've walked out of the northwest. We're not really wielding any influence there, so it's a question of how much we can do.
That brings us also back to the Obama administration question to Iran. As you mentioned, Iran now is much more influential in the region, has proxies all over. Speaking of Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen, what is the solution to this? I mean, I'm not sure if you want to comment on the nuclear deal and its outcome, and versus this administration's policy, which I would love to hear. But also today, the region with this Iranian presence that is, a lot of crimes committed, talks about demographical change. How do you see this?
Sure. Well, maybe I'll start with the nuclear deal and then talk about Iran's behavior in the region. So I supported the nuclear agreement. I still support the JCPOA.
You still do? Okay, I want to hear about that.
I mean, because fundamentally for the U.S., the biggest issue is the nuclear challenge, right? Globally, if Iran were to get nuclear weapons, what it would mean for all the other nuclear states in the world, potential nuclear states in the world. And by the way, it would do all the other bad things that the Iranians do, whether it's their support for Hezbollah or the Houthis or Iraqi Shia militias. All those become worse in an environment where they have a nuclear umbrella and they feel like nobody can attack them because they have a nuclear deterrent.
But do you think that JCPOA basically addressed this issue of having a nuclear weapon, knowing that there are, people, the inspectors were not even able to go to some specific sites underground where there are speculations that they might be continuing to enrich uranium?
Oh, no, I have very high confidence. Look, I was in the U.S. government for a number of years, the Pentagon, where what we did was plan for all the things we would have to do if negotiations didn't go well. And I can tell you, and I spent a lot of time looking at intelligence, I'm very confident that the nuclear deal addressed the nuclear question. That the inspections, that's actually the most important thing about the nuclear agreement are the transparency measures, are the inspections measures. They make it really, really hard for the Iranians to sort of sneak and secretly. I mean, it's not just the nuclear deal. It's the fact that we're not going to take our intelligence eye off the ball. Previously, the Iranians had 2 secret nuclear facilities. Both times those facilities were discovered before they even had 1 centrifuge in them. Those were Natanz and Fordo. Both Natanz and Fordo started out as secret nuclear facilities. Both of them were discovered by American and Western intelligence years before they even could put a centrifuge inside. So you add that, plus the transparency measures where you have 24 hours a day video eyes on all Iranian nuclear facilities and everything from the start of the program to the end of the program. I think that in terms of verification.
So what do you answer to these? Yeah, to these
yeah. So I think
claims?
that the answer is I think that on the nuclear question, like the JCPOA is more than adequate. The biggest weaknesses of the nuclear deal, there's two. One is the nuclear question, or one is what's is on the nuclear issue itself, which is the sunset provisions in the deal, where after 10 to 15 years, certain limitations start to come off of the agreement.
Yes.
And I think
2025 was it?
Yes, 2025 to 2030. And the answer to that, in my opinion, is basically what we do with non-proliferation agreements across the board globally, which is if it's working, you extend it. So what should happen is a new deal or an extension, so keep some of those limitations on board in exchange for certain sanctions relief and other things. I think that that's exactly what the Obama administration would have intended and what most people who worked on that agreement would have intended.
The second part that you don't agree with in the deal.
Right. The second part is that the regional issues are not addressed in the deal. And I recognize, so I believe that the regional issues are not as important as the nuclear issues, but I think they are more important than the treatment that they got, right? So I think that that's the, I think we always put the nuclear issue here and the regional issue here. I feel like that's how we did it in the Obama administration. We should have put the nuclear issue here, but we should have put the regional issue more like here. You know what I'm saying? Second, but a closer second. So I think that there could have been a lot more that we could have done. But I'm not sure that Trump, but I don't think it's just, it's not like Obama came in and all these things happened. I mean, this has been a bipartisan American problem and a failure. The Iranians killed 600 Americans in Iraq, mostly under George W. Bush. We did nothing to respond. The Iranians killed hundreds of Americans in Lebanon under Ronald Reagan. We did nothing to respond. Donald Trump, for all of his tough talk with Iran, all he's done is put sanctions back on. He hasn't done anything militarily. The only people who are doing anything militarily against the Iranians are the Israelis.
Yes.
And so, I don't think that Obama, it was Obama who suddenly somehow created this situation where Iran suddenly started taking over the region. I think this has been a long-term game that the Iranians have been playing. And that's how we need to think about it.
Today, this administration basically eliminated the deal. Put sanctions again back in place. Some argue that it's even much harder sanctions and much more diverse than before the deal was negotiated. Do you disagree with this new policy? And what do you think from this point? What would Iranians have to do or could do to be able to maybe change the mind of this current American president and his administration, who seems to be very, suspicious of the Iranian regime and not very trusting in whatever they try to say or claim?
Sure. So, the administration, I think that walking away from the JCPOA was a mistake. I think especially walking away from the JCPOA with no support internationally from our European partners, from the Russians, from the Chinese, from everybody else was a mistake. Because it leaves the United States isolated, which makes it harder to do things. But at this point, the other thing is, though, I think Donald Trump wants to come back and negotiate with Iran. He's made that pretty clear. He talks a tough game. We've moved all these military assets into the region, though I don't think we're anywhere near. I think it's important to emphasize we're nowhere near on the verge of an invasion of Iraq in Iran. We're not doing that. Moving one aircraft carrier back into the Middle East. When we invaded Iraq, we had 3 aircraft carriers in the Gulf and 2 more in the Mediterranean. Now, one aircraft carrier that was supposed to be there anyway, along with 1 ballistic missile defense battery after we pulled 4 out of the region just a few months ago. I mean, there's a lot of tough talk, but we're not militarily getting geared up for a fight. And the president keeps talking about how he wants to go back and negotiate with Iran. He wants to do what he did with Kim Jong-un in North Korea. He wants a big, glamorous summit where they can start having negotiations again. But the Iranians don't want that right now. The Iranians feel, basically a few things. They basically, they say, for Kim Jong-un, he never stood on the world stage with anybody, so this for him was a big deal. But we've been on the world stage negotiating for years now. We don't need this with Donald Trump. And also, secondly, we'd be rewarding him for walking away from the JCPOA. And so we're not going to do that. That's what they're saying right now. I think they're going to try to hold out for the next year or so. But if he's reelected, they'll find a way to negotiate with him again, because they'll have to, because their economy is under such duress.
So they're going to be trying to wait it out. Some argue they can't wait it out, even to the next elections.
Well, then maybe they go back into negotiations.
But this administration said that they would only want to negotiate with Khamenei. They don't trust in this hardliners versus quote-unquote, reformers in Iran. This doesn't exist.
I think the president will take, if the president gets his summit, I think he'll be fine with it. There's a difference between, like, you have Bolton and Pompeo are in one place on this, right? And Trump is on a different place. Bolton's out there basically threatening war, and then Trump is out there saying, I'm ready to negotiate, and it's just about the nuclear issue. And the Japanese Prime Minister, Shinzo Abe, is going over there over the next few days at Trump's request. And so I can see a scenario where Abe comes back, and he has an offer from the Iranians, and he's able to bypass all of Trump's advisors and just call Trump directly because he's a head of state and say, here, I have this offer. The Iranians want to talk. And Trump says, yes. I think that's probably not going to happen, but I think it's perfectly possible that it could happen. So it's complicated. They are,
Do you agree, with trusting in this regime? Knowing what they've done, seeing their history, knowing that they are, now saying that they're enriching uranium already. Why would we trust this regime again? Why would we give them another negotiations?
So there's a difference between, like, trust. What's the alternative? I don't think we trust them. I think you have to distrust and verify, right? Isn't that, you can distrust, but who do you negotiate with? You don't negotiate hard deals with people you trust. You negotiate hard deals with people you don't trust, but you have to find a way to live with. And so, look, the reality is, Iran has abided by the JCPOA. Iran has not violated the JCPOA. They are threatening to, they probably will in the weeks ahead, but the International Atomic Energy Agency just this week again reaffirmed that thus far, Iran has not violated the JCPOA, even though the United States has been violating it for more than a year. So
you want a JCPOA that includes the ballistic missile program, includes the support for proxies, Iranian proxies in the region that are committing sectarian and terrorist activities, including killing innocent civilians, and they're extremist group. They're Islamic extremists.
So I would argue for, you might have a nuclear deal apart from these other portfolios, but you need to start making progress on those other portfolios too. I'm less worried about the ballistic missiles, frankly. I think that's the least threatening of all their activities. Just because I don't think it has that much of an impact. The things to worry about are their support for extremist groups and terrorists and proxies, and their nuclear program. I'd love to see a deal on I'd love to see the U.S. back in the JCPOA or looking at an extension of that. And then I would like to see the U.S. being more aggressive and pushing back against Iran's regional behavior, while at the same time being open to a negotiation if we can push the Iranians into an uncomfortable position and get some concessions out of them. But doing that together with our regional partners. I think you got to address, you can't neglect the regional issues, but trying to mix it all into one huge deal might also be too much.
So categorize it and kind of deal with one entity at a time.
The P5, the P5 plus, you're not going to have a discussion on the regional issues without countries like Saudi Arabia or UAE in the discussion, or even Israel quietly in the discussion, right? These are key stakeholders.
Because Israel was very clear that they're not accepting, for example, an Iranian presence in Syria.
Right, exactly.
So what's the solution for that?
The Israelis say they will not accept any Iranian presence in Syria. I think the reality of Iran not being in Syria at all is a very high bar at this point. They've put like 100,000 people worth of militia groups into Syria. Hezbollah's there. You have the Afghan, Pakistani, various different groups. I think Israel wants the most limited presence of Iran in Syria possible. And most importantly, what Israel does not want in Syria is precision-guided missiles that could hit it. So the Israelis are going to continue to, Israelis actually, it's a good model for what we should be doing. The Israelis hit Iran militarily, and I'm all for that. And I think actually the U.S. could do more of that, frankly. at the sort of low level, deniable level without provoking a major conflict, but then also couple that with a willingness to negotiate. You can do both at the same time. And so that's what I would like to see.
Very interesting and I think complicated question, Iran, right?
Yeah.
Especially like you said, now the United States is, what could Iran do to the American allies in the region if things continue to escalate in terms of sanctions and in terms of tightening up on the Iranian economy? We saw a sample, but the United States did send the aircraft carrier. What else could Iran do, and what would the American appropriate response be if things keep escalating in terms of trying to disturb the oil market?
Sure. So a couple of different things. One is you could see Iran, two different response areas for them. One is, more like you had this incident with the sabotage of 4 ships in Fujairah. You could see something more escalatory, which would be, for example, an attack on a ship that was actually moving and had oil in it with a spill into the Strait of Hormuz, for example. Or things like that, sabotage of, we've had in the past cyber attacks on Saudi Aramco, things like that actually, and the reason the Iranians do this stuff, at least right now, the signal they're trying to send is, we can hurt you too. Like if you're going to do this to us, we can make life difficult for you. But they were pretty careful to not go over the top. The things that they did were purposefully relatively low level, and I actually thought that the regional response was also purposefully pretty restrained, because nobody really wants an all-out war on either side. So I think that the Emiratis and the Saudis were wise in sort of pursuing a relatively quiet response, but I think we need to keep things at that level. The other danger is the Iranians decide to do something, for example, hit some Americans in Iraq or try to push American troops out of Iraq politically. And that could also escalate. And you could definitely see a situation where the Iranians do some of these things thinking it's not going to create a problem. The U.S. responds with a low-level symbolic strike. Tensions start to rise. Then the U.S. will hurriedly bring a lot of forces into the region right away just to protect itself, and Iran will start to disperse all of its missiles and mines, again, just to protect itself. Both sides see these defensive steps as offensive, and then things start to escalate, and you could end up in a real pretty ugly fight.
And Iraq, you think, is the sensitive spot for that?
I think Iraq is...
Because it's both American and Iranian presence is very prevalent.
Yes, the two most sensitive spots right now are Iraq and basically the Gulf, around... basically shipping. Those are the two areas of the highest sort of friction.
I want to move to the Palestinian-Israeli issue. You've worked under the Obama administration also on the negotiations between the Palestinians and Israelis, which wasn't moving in any direction at the time. The Obama administration was accused of being anti-Israel. How do you view, do you agree with those claims? And obviously you probably disagree with that. And then, today we have a new plan that this administration is working on, which we'll talk about later. How do you view what you guys accomplished during the Obama administration? What was the hope and what was the objectives of the negotiations at the time, and why didn't they move in the direction that you were intending to move it?
Sure. So I definitely, there's a lot of accusations out there about President Obama was anti-Israel. President Obama, who cut a 10-year, $40 billion arms deal to basically give $40 billion to Israel for its security. The man was not anti-Israel. It's silly. He had a tough relationship with Bibi Netanyahu, but that has to do more with the fact that Netanyahu is this sort of very conservative leader who has moved in the wrong direction and has taken Israel in the wrong direction. And being pro-Israel doesn't necessarily mean always agreeing with Israel's government. So, what we tried to do was negotiate peace between Israelis and Palestinians. That's what John Kerry wanted to do. And the reality is it failed. It failed like previous efforts failed before, for a lot of different reasons. I think the most fundamental reason why it failed is because you have these two leaders, Bibi Netanyahu and Mahmoud Abbas, both of whom are incredibly risk-averse individuals. Neither of these guys are the types of leaders who see their people and see where they need to take their people and can lead them in that direction and say, they are here, I will take them there. People like Yitzhak Rabin or Anwar Sadat, you know, people who really were able to be brave leaders who took their people to a place where they were not. That is not Bibi Netanyahu or Mahmoud Abbas. Both of them are incredibly risk averse, and on top of that, they also really don't like each other personally. So you're asking these two guys who don't like each other, who are so risk averse, basically to stand at the edge of the cliff. Each puts on a parachute, grab the other guy's ripcord, jump together and pull. It's never going to happen with these two, period. And so I think that's where we are on this, unfortunately.
And that's where we are today.
Still, yes.
Until September, we'll see what's going to happen, and we'll talk about that too.
Sure.
But we do have the same leaders for both sides today, and this administration is much more ambitious. The Jared Kushner team has been working on an actual deal that is challenging the old format that was sponsored and looked at by Washington. You know, I know there's a lot of leaks. The lead hasn't come out yet. We were expecting to see it now, but obviously probably the Israeli elections that, you know, now are going to happen in September are probably putting some breaks there on the release date. What do you expect from this new deal of the century, quote unquote? And do you think coming out of this old model is something more realistic to maybe look at this ongoing struggle where nobody has been able to find solution to?
Yeah, no. I think that what they are doing is going to go nowhere. And actually, I wouldn't be surprised if we never see the deal of the century. At all. My biggest concern is they have so shifted in favor of Israel that they've undercut the U.S. role as mediator at all in the process. And that starts with the decision to move the embassy to Jerusalem, which I would have been okay with if there had been something for the Palestinians too. So if you do something big symbolically for the Israelis politically, do something big for the Palestinians too. Say, we're moving the embassy to Jerusalem and we're looking forward to having 2 embassies in Jerusalem one day, one for the future state of Palestine and one for Israel. Like, say something like that, you know, instead of the way they did it. Then they followed it up with all these other things, you know, cutting aid to the Palestinians, cutting aid to UNRWA, closing the PLO mission here in Washington, closing the American consulate, which is the way that in Jerusalem, which is how the U.S. deals with the Palestinians. Doing all those things, the Palestinians have refused to talk to them for almost 2 years. So how are you a mediator putting out a big, bold new plan where no serious Palestinian government official in a position of decision-making authority will even talk to you? So I think that this has created an impossible barrier for them to climb. I mean, just the fact they're doing this conference in Bahrain later this month. Yes, nobody's coming. No Palestinian officials are coming, right? I mean, all these Palestinian business people are refusing to come. So in this environment, I just don't see how you possibly put out a plan that could work.
You know, I do hear your concerns about this, but you know, in the past, we haven't seen any other approach work. So why not? And that's the argument of people today in Washington who are pro the Kushner, you know, progress and process that he's working on, is that, you know, you need to come out of that old frame that didn't produce, that people in the Palestinians are also suffering, and then just the status quo is not helping them. What is the alternative?
Right. I mean, so you can make that case, and that's fine. Like, clearly, like, American peacemaking efforts over the past 25 years have failed. But their total disregard for the Palestinian side, and also they like to go around and they say, you know, all the experts have tried and all the experts have failed, and so now we're going to try it, and we're going to do something different. So, I mean, this is the equivalent of saying, I took my car to a mechanic and it didn't, and they tried to fix it and it failed, didn't work. So I took it to another mechanic and it also didn't work. So I took it to a florist. Your florist is not going to fix your car. Like, coming up with a delusional plan out of nowhere is not going to, like, that doesn't even work with the Palestinians, isn't going to work. So what would I argue for instead? I would argue for first of all, I would argue for American engagement on Gaza in a much more serious way, where I think the U.S. can work with Egypt and the United Nations. We put out a big report on this a few months ago to alleviate the humanitarian crisis in Gaza and start to create political conditions for a long-term deal between Israel, the PLO, and Hamas on sort of slowly having the PLO retake control of Gaza and also a long-term ceasefire between Israel and Hamas to stop the fighting. I would argue for immediate steps on the ground. Instead of trying to go for a big deal, look at basic steps on the ground that stop Israeli settlement activity, that start to address like Palestinian support for violence, things like that that can at least, or even get the Israelis to take some unilateral steps that are positive, you know, to sort of start giving back some parts of the West Bank and saying Palestinians Area C, which is the area of the West Bank controlled by Israel, giving the Palestinians the ability to start doing more in terms of business and, you know, housing in these areas. You know, there are 200,000 Palestinian homes or people living in Area C. So they're under threat of Israeli demolition every day.
Area C meaning?
So Area C is basically the West Bank is divided into areas A, B, and C. Area C is the area of the West Bank that's under Israeli control. It's 60% of the West Bank. It's only got about 5% of the population in it. Most of the big cities are all controlled by the Palestinians.
Yes.
If, let's say there's these 200,000 Palestinians living in Area C, their homes are under threat. Tomorrow, Israel could demolish their homes because technically it's illegal for them to have homes there. If tomorrow Israel said all those homes are illegal, that'll make a huge difference in people's lives. There's little things that you can do like that that are much more sensible than right now, like talking about a $65 billion economic plan that doesn't make any sense because nobody believes it, and that's got no support from the Palestinians. So I would argue for more steps on the ground, more practical things that can be done instead of trying to do this deal of the century, which is a joke.
But also there are people on the Israeli side who find it very difficult to accept Israel giving up many of the settlements, the large settlements in the West Bank. How would you convince that side as well to having an alternative peace deal that you've been working on or that could be offered in the future? How could you come up with something that's realistically acceptable by both sides?
Sure. So, the reality is that in terms of settlements, yes, you have about somewhere between 500 and 700,000 Israelis living at this point in settlements or in East Jerusalem. But any land deal would include swaps. So basically what you do is you try to take these areas that are Israeli, where you have Israeli populations, and keep them, as many of them as possible, as part of Israel. And in exchange, give the Palestinians land that's inside Israel, not inside the West Bank, but that has no population on it. So that both states would still have the same amount of territory.
Isn't that part of the deal of the century as well?
Well, that's
the
part
land
of
swap.
Land swap. So it might be. It's been part of other deals. But the question is, the reality is, most plans have tried to put you'd have to do something like 3 to 7% of the West Bank to get like 85% of the settlers into Israel. Into Israel. Yes. So yes, the question is, nobody knows what the map looks like or how that all plays out. But the problem with the deal of the century is, again, I don't know what's in the contents of the deal itself. Nobody does. But the context of what's been created around it, the incredible negativism from the Palestinians because they haven't even talked to them for the Americans for a year and a half because they don't trust the Trump administration. Like, that's where your challenge comes in. And I do believe ultimately it's a very good chance the plan never gets put down because we have now new Israeli elections. That'll go till September. The Israeli government then won't form until like November. Now we're into American elections. And is the president going to put down a big plan of the century in the middle of a U.S. election? Not at all clear that he will. So it's quite possible that the Kushner plan is on ice for the next couple of years.
In your opinion, this is historical what just happened with the Benjamin Netanyahu coalition. And now we're looking into new elections, given the situation in Israel. What do you expect us seeing There are obviously a big support for Bibi and the Likud, but also there is the coalition of blue and white, and now they also have 35 seats alone. What do you expect seeing? I mean, I know it's hard to predict, but some people are talking about the next coming election. And this really means a lot for Benjamin Netanyahu because he has the legal issues as well.
Sure. So I think nobody knows what's going to happen, right? And the parties are still forming and coalitions and like all these sort of complexities of Israeli politics. But the most likely scenario is that the votes are pretty similar to what they were last time, where Likud and the right wing get the most seats. But if Netanyahu doesn't have, here's the thing, if Netanyahu has less than 61 out of 120 without Avigdor Lieberman, right? Because the reason that we're having these new elections is because Avigdor Lieberman refused to go into the coalition with Netanyahu. Why did Lieberman refuse to go into the coalition with Netanyahu? There's some things about an ultra-Orthodox and their role, but that was just politics. The real reason was
so there's a real reason. What is that?
He hates Netanyahu.
Okay.
And he sees this as an opportunity to get rid of Netanyahu.
And why did you think he hates Netanyahu?
Personal, for years.
Oh, for years. It doesn't have nothing to do with transferring money to Hamas and that Lieberman was against at one point.
That's all politics. I mean, meaning like he'll take positions that he thinks are, at the end of the day, like, Lieberman used to work for Netanyahu.
Yeah, he was the defense minister.
Yeah, no, but he used to be his chief of staff 20 years ago. He was part of Likud. And they worked very closely together, and they just don't like each other at all. They had an ugly falling out. This is true. Bibi has a hard time with a lot of people working together. So here's the thing. If Netanyahu can't form a government, if Netanyahu were to go away tomorrow, the Likud could form a government with blue and white. Blue and white, which is the centrist party, will not go into a coalition with a prime minister who's under indictment. But they would go into a national unity government with Likud without Bibi.
Yes.
And so this is what they wanted the last time. Now, if the elections come out exactly the same as last time, and Lieberman refuses, eventually Likud might just have to kick Bibi aside, cut a deal with blue and white, and you'd have a Likud prime minister together with the blue and white prime minister, some kind of national unity government. And
that's viewed very positively by many people, is to have more of a right and center kind of coalition. In your opinion, I mean, we talked about the Israeli side. On the Palestinian side, you talked about Mahmoud Abbas being very wary of taking risks, but also there's a lot of allegation of corruption against the PLO. And then, obviously Gaza is another situation where Hamas, I mean, the Palestinians are suffering also because of the leaders that are not providing for them the services and there's loss of waste of resources and all of that. So how could the United States handle these issues to help the Palestinians further? I mean, when you talk about having investments in that area, that could help if there are some elements of just assuring that the money is not taking and elsewhere, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, right now there's very little investment in the West Bank and especially in Gaza. It's because of bad governments on the Palestinian side, and then it's also because of Israeli restrictions, which make it very hard to invest or make businesses work. So you need to sort of end both. The reality is Palestinians are deeply disillusioned with their own leaders. Increasingly, what you hear from young Palestinians now is they don't even want two states anymore. They don't really care. What they want is they want a passport. They want a good job. They want an ability to be able to express themselves. Like, they don't care, they would love to have those things in the future state of Palestine, but if it's got to be in Israel, that's fine with them too.
But the one-state solution is completely unacceptable by many people as well.
Yes, exactly. So that's the problem, right? Like, for the Israelis, that's completely anathema, right? Because then you lose the Jewish nature of the state of Israel. For Palestinians, a one-state solution with different types of citizenship for Palestinians is also unacceptable. And then that's when you start to talk about things like apartheid state.
Yes.
And so neither of those work well. And so then you end up with two-state solution still being the best of all the options, because it's the only one that can guarantee a democratic and Jewish Israel and a Palestine where Palestinians can live in dignity and justice and security. I would love to see that. I don't see it happening anytime soon right now with the current leadership on both sides. And also with leadership from the United States that isn't there.
I mean, this is a very complex, story. This is a complicated region, so this is definitely going to be expected. My last question would be about the current. We're seeing that there is a change in attitude towards Israel by many Arab countries, including Gulf countries, and we're seeing that dynamic change. How much do you think? I mean, can we see an Arab-Israeli normalization and relationship without having an end to the conflict and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict on the side? I mean, some people are hinting that this is where things are heading, but do you think this is a realistic approach, that we might have some kind of, collaboration, which we've already been seeing, but minus a solution for the Palestinian-Israeli conflict?
I have a hard time seeing, so there's definitely overlapping interests. There's definitely more quiet cooperation going on between Israel and the Arab states and the Gulf states in particular, especially on security questions and especially in terms of dealing with Iran. But I think it runs up against limitations based on politics around the Israeli-Palestinian issue. So do you have to get to a two-state solution in the end of the conflict to get normalization? I don't know if you have to get that far, but you have to make real, meaningful progress on the Palestinian front if you want to get beyond the quiet cooperation to much more public cooperation between Israel and the Gulf states.
I want to end it here. Thank you so much for this refreshing point of view on this show. Thank you so much, Ilan Goldenberg, for coming out, and I'll love to have you again in the future.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. It'll be great to come back.
Thank you.
Sure.
That was it for tonight's episode. Thank you for watching us. Good night.